Hello, everyone. My name is Julie Bone. I'm the Boreal Program Manager for Ontario Nature, and welcome to our first Indigenous engagement training webinar for Atlas-3. As we are not able to gather in person today, I'll provide a land acknowledgement from where I reside. I'm calling in from Thunder Bay, which was built on the traditional territory of Fort William First Nation, and we are signatories to the Robinson Superior Treaty of 1850. These are the homelands of the Anishinaabe people, and I also recognize the contributions made to my community and this land by Métis people and all of the Indigenous land defenders who have been protecting our lands and waters since time immemorial. Atlas-3 has made a commitment to supporting reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, and conversations on how best to strengthen relationships with Indigenous peoples and communities is currently taking place through the Atlas-3 Indigenous Engagement Working Group. For today's webinar, it is designed to help the key staff and volunteers working on Atlas-3 to start with some shared understanding on what reconciliation is and how it may be integrated into our Atlas-3 work over the next 5 years and hopefully beyond. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Lana Ray, who will be leading our workshop today. Dr. Ray is an Anishinaabe scholar from the Upwaganissinin, also known as Red Rock Indian Band, located in Northwestern Ontario. And Dr. Ray is an assistant professor in the Department of Indigenous Learning at Lakehead University. She has previously worked in the public and not-for-profit sectors, including as a director of policy and research at a provincial Indigenous organization. Her work seeks to advance Indigenous social, cultural, and political realities through resurgent and decolonizing practices. Dr. Ray is currently the principal investigator and co-principal investigator on several CIHR and SSHRC-funded research projects. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ray.
So, bonjour, hi everyone. Miigwech for that introduction, Dr. Bone. And so maybe I'll start too. So Julie had started with a land acknowledgement. And so this is something that you probably have heard at some point. When someone starts a session or begins speaking, they also give their traditional introduction, or it's often called that. But when we as Anishinaabe people also give our traditional introduction, that's also a form of protocol and also a form of land acknowledgement. It just looks a little bit different. So I'm going to start by sharing that. So, Bojo, Weskane Gijagok, Nadijnakaz, Ajau Kanoje, Nadodem, Apwaganisinin, Nadonjaba, Kamanistakwa, Nindao, Miigwech Gijemnado, Miigwech Gichigami, Miigwech Noden, Miigwech Zogpo, Miigwech Beneshi, Miigwech. So I probably could have went on there, but I just said thank you to some of the lands we have around here, Lake Superior, and I also said a thank you to the birds as well. And so this is just an image or some images to help you understand a bit better of where I'm situated as well. So part of my own traditional introduction or protocols that I shared talks about my relationship with land. So being from Apwaganissinin, we're located on the Nipigon River. So that's the picture that you're seeing here in the top corner. And so people may or may not be aware, but the Nipigon River, it's still really well known for its fishing. At the same time, at around the mid 1900s, there was a lot of overfishing that was happening within the Nipigon River. And so what happened as a result, and this was part of the tourism sector as well, and was also done in conjunction with the railroad. So there was a lot of magazines and publications which urged people to come and try their luck in the Nipigon River. So, and we even have, well, it actually burnt now. There was we had a museum in Nipigon, the town adjacent to my community, and it had the world's largest, I think, speckled trout And so that was actually, it was a man by the name of Dr. James Cook, who everyone said caught the fish. However, during that time, there was a lot of Indigenous fishing guides. So no one ever hears the name of the Indigenous fishing guide who was with Dr. Cook when he caught the fish. And I don't even know the name of the fishing guide. And so what had happened in my territory is because of this influx of tourists and people coming to fish, fish got depleted. So in response to that, what the government did is they basically declared that it was Indigenous peoples, Anishinaabe peoples, who were the problem. We were the ones who were overfishing. So there was now a conservation issue, and we really shouldn't have access to our traditional territories anymore to be able to fish. And at the meantime, there was different strategies or ideas that were talked about as to how to address this. And so stocking different types of fish, or even creating the same kind of fishing conditions someplace else. And so while that maybe works for the fishermen and fisherwomen who came to the area, it certainly didn't work for us as Anishinaabe people, where no matter what the fishing conditions were, this would be a place that we'd continue to stay and live. So I just wanted to share a little bit of that. And I think already you could start to see some of the intersections, some key concepts or understandings that we could look at in terms of reconciliation, and even start to see how conservation plays a role in terms of Indigenous relations. And so the other pictures you see, these are the pictographs along the Nipigon River. So just to demonstrate the long and ongoing presence that we have. And a lot of the times our pictographs are also about our own protocols and acknowledging the other beings that reside or live in or near the water, and honoring the treaties that we have with them as well. So when we're thinking about relationships with land from an Anishinaabe perspective, they aren't human-centric. In fact, if anything, they're anything but human-centric. And it's really about our relationships largely with the different nations, so animal nation, bird nation, but also some other nations and beings that are more or less have been considered myth by Western society. And in my introduction, I also introduced my clan. So I'm from the Muskie clan, the fish clan. So that's the picture you see here. And we also have stories about our clans that it's not just a relationship where there's certain features within an animal that I admire and then I try to mimic those. But we have stories that talk about our kinship relationship with our clans. And then the last picture you see here, that's just a visual for my Anishinaabe name that I also shared with everyone here today. So in terms of our session objectives, so we have a couple. One is really to, I say define, but I would say it's a bit more loose than that. It's really about our discussion of reconciliation and what that means. And one thing we'll talk about is that reconciliation has really been approached in a number of different ways by a number of different people. And so we're going to look at some of those different expressions and talk about what their implications can be in terms of Indigenous settler relations and their impact on Indigenous peoples. We'll also take some time to understand why reconciliation is needed, and we won't spend a lot of time here, but I just want to contextualize a little bit the relationship between Indigenous peoples in the context of environmentalism. And if anyone isn't aware of kind of the long and ongoing history of colonialism within what's now known as Canada, I would really recommend having a look at both the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So it's quite lengthy, as well as the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. So that's a document from the 1990s. So both of those documents will provide you with really a broad understanding of some of the key issues that have happened in terms of that history and ongoing legacy of colonialism. And so we're also going to identify and discuss some barriers to reconciliation. And then I think this is kind of the key point, and perhaps the point that there's been less attention given to in terms of reconciliation. And really that's about identifying and discussing key actions to be able to advance reconciliation. And this session, as Julie had mentioned, it's really an opportunity for you to explore the relationship between reconciliation as well as the bird atlas, and how you're situated and your place within that work as well. So I have a schedule in place, but by all means, we don't have to stick to it. I welcome any questions as we're going along. And I've included a couple of activities, interactive activities for us to participate in at the end. And so we could just play it by ear. There's a few, we may not get to all of them, but that's okay. And I know 2.5 hours is a long time, so probably about halfway through our session, we'll take a break. So I haven't designated that at any particular spot, but we'll just kind of see when it naturally lends itself to a break. And if I happen to not pick up on those cues, also feel free to jump in and say, you know, I think this is a good time for us to take a break, and we could do that as well. So maybe just to start, and you don't have to, you could keep this to yourself if you want, but just to think about what reconciliation right now, what does that mean to you? So take a minute or two, jot down some ideas. You could even think about it, you know, just in your head. And if you want to, feel free to share a little bit about that in the comment box as well. So again, just take a couple of minutes to reflect on that. Okay, I am seeing there's a couple of people who are willing to share, and I've put that in the chat box. So Kathleen says, reconciliation to me means learning about and discussing the history of colonialism and Indigenous rights movement, and being humble enough to accept what I need to unlearn and relearn. Yeah, so I think there's a couple of key points there. The idea of education, and we often hear that in regards to the truth and reconciliation, right? Before there could be reconciliation, there needs to be truth. So it's really hard to address or fix something when you don't know what the problem is. And also I think this piece around being humble is another key piece. And that part can be hard sometimes too, in terms of, I would say with being humble also, being able to listen openly. So the ongoing history of colonialism, that certainly isn't, I think, the topic that anyone would choose on any given day to talk about, unless it was so important that we did. And so it's difficult to kind of hear about the history of Canada, as well as the ongoing actions of Canada that continue to be harmful to Indigenous peoples. And it might be difficult as well sometimes if we come to broach conversations of how we may have benefited from that history of colonialism. And I think especially it may be difficult if we're in a place where we don't know what we can do to actually contribute to a difference. And then the last piece here is about the need to unlearn as well as to relearn. So that's also a key point. And I think education, open listening, and reflection has a key part in that, about the need to unlearn and relearn. So yeah, that's all really great. And I'm just moving down now. We see changing my own inherent unconscious thought process about Indigenous peoples. So I think we're starting to even see some themes here in terms of the need to be able to unlearn as well as relearn. And this is an interesting characterization too. And I know there's kind of been ongoing conversations and debates about this idea of unconscious thought. So I think individually, at an individual level, it definitely can be at times an unconscious thought, but also I think acknowledging that that's brought about by really purposeful, systematic efforts that lead to a place where we perhaps have these unconscious thoughts, where we normalize maybe particular histories or social norms or relationships. And so the next one, knowing where Indigenous communities are on the landscape is important, as well as the community names. Acknowledging that on maps it's often just settler communities, as if Indigenous communities don't exist. And so what this individual is talking about here is really kind of at the crux to the type of colonialism that we experience here in Canada. So you'll hear the term colonialism and it's used really broadly, but there's different types of colonialism. So for example, in not all cases did the colonial state actually stay and reside within the territory. So in some cases it was about extraction of resources. But what we see here in Canada is that there was actually, as we're all witness and testament to, right, with all of us being here, it was the strategy was also about creating a settlement here. And so you may have heard this term settler colonialism. And so that's what that's really speaking about, this form of colonialism where it's really about not just stripping the land of its resources, but also naturalizing the colonial state's existence and presence on that territory. And so in order to do that, the main strategy has been to eliminate Indigenous peoples. And that's been done in a number of different ways. So one way is the physical elimination of Indigenous peoples. And so we've seen that through mass disease, both historically as well as today, and poor health outcomes. We see that in terms of state violence against Indigenous peoples. And so both in terms of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, although they use the term cultural genocide, if you actually look at the definition of genocide itself, it includes cultural genocide. So it's a bit puzzling to me why the term cultural genocide is used instead of just genocide. But so through Indian residential schools as well, so there's been this ongoing history of physical elimination. And that was also noted in the recent report coming out of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Inquiry. But then we also see other forms of erasure. So this physical erasure in different forms, such as not including Indigenous peoples on maps, not including the names of particular territories. So even when I did my traditional introduction, I had talked about Gitchigami. So that's the traditional name for Lake Superior. And I talked about Apuaganissinin instead of the name for the area of Red Rock Indian Band and Nipigon in the broader territory. And so what that is really speaking to is if anyone's had a chance, or if you are in the future driving across Ontario, when you're by around Red Rock, which is a little community in Northern Ontario, you'll see just that. You'll see high cliffs that are red. And so that's actually where we created our pipes from, sacred pipes from. So you could see why our traditional names and naming is important and isn't beneficial to the Canadian state, because right within our traditional names, it really demonstrates that ongoing relationship that we have to the land. And so that needs to be severed for the Canadian state to really claim their legitimacy to this territory. And so the next one, reconciliation means addressing power imbalances as well, and processes of consent. And we'll talk about that one a little bit more as we go along. So I think what Julie had mentioned there, when I talked about there's different forms or different ways people conceive of reconciliation. So those are often the pieces that perhaps get forgotten about, the ones that really have the potential to transform the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, as well as the state. And so that could be difficult, and there's obvious reasons why perhaps a state would not want to do that, because to do that means you would have to relinquish some power and privilege as well. So we see having conversations, so real conversations, learning from each other, hearing stories, having true empathy. Yeah, so these are all important as well to reconciliation. And I think these are really important if we tie them to action too. So if anyone kind of has been keeping an eye on Indigenous settler relations over the last couple of decades, one thing we know is there's been a lot of reports that have came out. So we've had a number of inquiries, both at a national level, but also at provincial or local levels as well. And one thing, if we look at all these reports, they're all basically saying the same thing. And it's all very similar stories that Indigenous peoples are sharing. So in terms of reconciliation, I think we have to be careful about, or maybe be respectful and have a sense of responsibility when we're asking someone to share our story. And that's within a Anishinaabe tradition. That's how we approach storytelling. So when someone tells us a story, we have a responsibility to really listen to that story. We have a responsibility to form a relationship with that story if it's appropriate. And then we have a responsibility to live that story in many ways. So if we're hearing ongoing stories about really Indigenous suffering, how many of those stories do we need to hear? So at what point do we then begin to live those stories and think, how can these stories then help us go from understanding to action? We're seeing a couple more here. Means looking forward with that history and current place in mind. Yeah, absolutely. So at the same time with reconciliation, it's hard to reconcile, or perhaps it's looks very, not genuine if you're continuing to carry out the same actions as the ones that you're currently trying to reconcile for. So that's important about moving forward from history, but also keeping it in our minds so that history isn't repeated. Working towards making life the best for Indigenous peoples in whichever way they want. And that's another really key point, I think, about in the ways that Indigenous peoples want. So in terms of the recommendations, so there was 94 recommendations that came out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And what often happens is those recommendations kind of get plucked from the context of the overall document and implemented. And sometimes that happens without engagement with the local Indigenous community to prioritize. Are there recommendations that we want to focus on? Are they meaningful to you? How could we go about doing that? So that's a really important piece. And so when we think about reconciliation, both in Indigenous contexts, as well as within even non-Indigenous contexts, we know the person or community or nation or whatever that looks like that we're trying to reconcile with. That's just common sense, right? They kind of know what they want and what they need, and can help guide that reconciliation process. So again, we're seeing is about learning and acknowledging the history. This theme again about having to unlearn as well. And again, this idea of bringing Indigenous peoples into discussion and also decision-making roles. So yeah, a lot of really important points that were brought up. And so in the presentation, I'll perhaps go through it a little bit more quickly and skip over some things, because I think a lot of the main points have already been generated within your points that you've brought up. So as I mentioned, storytelling is an important way of coming to know within the Anishinaabe tradition. So I thought I would also introduce reconciliation a bit further by sharing a story. And so I'm sure many of you would recognize this bird here. And so I brought up this image, and again, thinking about learning from our history as well, and maybe picking up on that point. So at around in the 1950s and early 60s, there was actually a campaign that took place in China, and the campaign was called the Four Pests Campaign. And it really was about a process of people conquering nature. And the idea behind it was that many of these quote unquote pests were actually causing issues in terms of economic development and grain production and different things like that. So the decision was made to eradicate these four pests. So there was flies and mosquitoes and rats, and sparrows were one of them. And so although this kind of seemed like a good plan in theory, and so efforts were made then to eradicate these different creatures, what actually happened when there was no sparrows left, it actually then created space for other quote unquote pests. And what actually resulted was a large loss of crops, and then mass famine within the nation. And so I bring this up because I think in many ways, just like this campaign, with reconciliation, intentions can often be good, but they may lack that deep understanding needed to actually carry things forward in a good way. So within this campaign, there just wasn't the understanding about the interrelationship between these different creatures, the role that the sparrow plays, a respect and understanding for the sparrow. And so while those good intentions were there of wanting to have economic success for the nation, which presumably would result in, you know, good outcomes for the nation and for communities, that's not what happened. So same thing for reconciliation, and I talked about this already a little bit when I talked about the 94 calls to actions from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission kind of being plucked out of their context. So sometimes within reconciliation, there's the same narrow vision of what that looks like, and it's not approached from the holistic way that it needs to be approached from. So it needs to be holistic, but it also needs to be nuanced and it needs to be localized. So reconciliation can look different in different communities or in different parts of the province. So if we're just looking for kind of a simple definition about what reconciliation is, this is a definition from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And maybe just to back up a little bit and provide some context of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So that commission came out of the Indian residential schools settlement. And why that was necessary is because from about the 1880s, although forms of Indian residential schools were happening much earlier than that, about 50 years earlier. But from the 1800s right up until 1996, Indian residential schools were in operation. And so Indian residential schools was a system or a mechanism that really sought to destroy Indigenous people's relationships. So relationships they had with each other, because within these schools, it was children, often at a very young age. So my grandmother, she was sent to residential school when she was 5 years old, and she stayed there for 7 years. So when she went to residential school, she knew how to speak her language. And when she left, she didn't. So she could understand it a little bit, but she couldn't speak it. And even up until the time she passed, she still hadn't regained her ability to speak her language. So and within our languages too, our languages are really important because embedded in our languages are our worldviews and how we relate to each other and how we relate to the world. So that's what residential schools are really about, severing relationships. So to land, between communities, from culture. And by doing that, that again was one of those ways to actually erase Indigenous peoples. So if we send Indigenous children to Indian residential school, then maybe they won't recognize their traditional territory. Maybe they won't have that relationship with it. So when it comes time, perhaps in the courts, when these people have to explain and show their relationship to the territory, they won't have that memory. They won't be able to. So it was really one of those key mechanisms to support settler colonialism. So because of all of the harm that was caused by Indian residential schools, that's what brought about this Indian residential school agreement. and that agreement comes from 2007. And so an interesting point to note about that agreement too is it's widely been documented, the perspective by Indigenous scholars and others, that that agreement was really a way to mitigate loss on the part of the federal government. So it wasn't a process where the federal government did their reflection, realized the harm that was caused, and said, we're going to step up on our own, take responsibility, and do the right thing. So that was not the context for the Indian Residential School Agreement. And so part of the settlement was the striking of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And when we look at that commission, again, the structures of that commission very much were dictated by the federal government. So on the foundation of this idea of reconciliation in Canada, what we see is it started off with a federal government not approaching from a place of responsibility. We then see it was money from the Indian residential school survivors from their settlement that covered the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And then we also see that the federal government still had quite a lot of control over that process. So if we take that out of the context, I don't really know many cases where someone's then responsible to pay for someone who's done them harm to then learn and make amends. So that's just something that we need to recognize, that foundation upon the TRC in and of itself is already a flawed system. And so I think when we see the different iterations of reconciliation, then that makes sense, because from the get-go, we started off with two very different notions from two parties of what reconciliation could be. So from the federal government's perspective, and this is my expert opinion, as well as many other Indigenous scholars talk about that. It's really been a strategy to mitigate risk and to mitigate dissent and to gain back public trust and public support in terms of relationships with Indigenous peoples. So aside from kind of that problematic history from which reconciliation emerged, I think there's still value within the commission. And in particular, I think that this definition provides a good place for us to start. And you'll notice in this definition, I think a lot of what like you had talked about in your comments is present within this definition. So it's about establishing and maintaining a mutually respectful relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples. And I've highlighted this part because it kind of shows some steps. It also says in order for that to happen, these steps need to happen. So that piece around awareness, or as we've talked about, education, acknowledgement of harm, I think, which ties into that idea of education, atonement for the causes, as well as action to change that behavior. And the other part I think that's really important in this definition is that it says in order for that to happen, there has to be. So again, I find people will sometimes pull out this language around mutually respectful relationships and just present that in and of itself as reconciliation. And so just kind of forgetting about, what had happened, forgetting about perhaps the education, the atonement, and the actions, and just focusing on, well, moving forward, let's do this. And I think after the apology for Indian residential schools by the former Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, that was very much the attitude. We've done our apology, so you just need to move on with your life. That was basically the sentiment. And I had mentioned before the idea that these recommendations, these 94 calls to action, really just kind of get plucked and used out of context. So I wanted to bring this to your attention, and this is provided to you in a handout as well. So these are the principles of reconciliation. So there's 10 principles. And again, while these aren't perfect by any means, they at least, I think, are a starting point and provide much more context on how we could approach reconciliation versus the broader conversations we hear that just speak to mutually respectful relationships, although that's part of this, or that just refer to the 94 calls to action. And maybe the other thing to point out about the TRC is that, again, because it came out of a specific context, not everyone was included in the engagement. So it was specifically about trying to address wrongs or harms caused by Indian residential schools. So it was largely Indian residential school survivors who were engaged in that process. So the TRC is used as kind of this catch-all document for us to think about reconciliation in what's now known as Canada. However, it wasn't necessarily designed with that in mind. So it was designed to impact or affect just a piece of that in terms of making amends for the legacy of Indian residential schools. So here are the principles of reconciliation. And I didn't include the full United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but that's another document too, if you want to further your understanding of reconciliation. And maybe another thing to point out too, while the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is a good starting point, it's also not a perfect document. So there was a lot of negotiation that took place to create the declaration, and Indigenous peoples had to make a lot of concessions in terms of that document. And there's, different levels of the way in which the Canadian state thinks or takes into consideration the declaration as well. So Canada, when the declaration first came out, Canada was one of only 4 countries who opposed the declaration. And it was actually all settler colonial states who opposed it. So it was Canada, it was the United States, it was Australia, and it was New Zealand. So Canada was a late adopter of the declaration. And so there's nothing right now, although there's a bill in the process to actually ensure that there's no mechanism right now to have that legally enshrined within all of Canada. There is within BC, but we even see it's problematic there. And so really at the core of it, what the declaration talks about is Indigenous peoples' rights to be self-determining. And so when we think about reconciliation, it's also important to think about and understand First Nation, Inuit, and Métis treaty, constitutional, and human rights. And so treaty rights are just that, rights that come from treaties. Human rights, right, those are universal. However, we know Indigenous peoples have their human rights impacted or violated way more often, and rights that come out of the Constitution. So again, I think to strengthen this, to talk about our inherent rights as Indigenous peoples too. And so the importance of inherent rights is it fundamentally includes that idea that we don't exist just in relationship to the state. That's what treaty and constitutional rights are about, our relationship to the state. But we were here before the Canadian state. We have treaties with other nations, both Indigenous nations, as well as I had spoke about in terms of my traditional protocol, animal nations, different non-human nations as well. And so we have rights that stem from those treaties as well that need to be honored and upheld. So reconciliation is also about a process of healing of relationships that requires public truth sharing, apology, and commemoration. And so this was maybe at the heart of a lot of the controversy we saw over statues. So statues of John A. Macdonald, for example, or others who their actions and their ideologies were really harmful to Indigenous peoples. So there was a discussion of these are still our national heroes. We should keep the monuments up, or perhaps maybe we provide some context but keep the monuments up. And there was others who were saying, you know, these monuments are triggering and they need to be pulled down. So even when we're looking at some of these principles, we could see there's still a lot of work to be done before we get to a place where, as a nation, where we're really in a place where we could implement these. Because we saw a lot of opposing views in terms of what should be done with the monuments. And so reconciliation also requires constructive action on addressing ongoing legacies of colonialism. And so we see that in all facets of our society today. In terms of justice, we know there's Indigenous peoples are overrepresented in the justice system. We're over-policed, but when it comes to our own protection, we're also under-policed at that point. And so the environmental field isn't located here as well, but that also needs to be part of the conversation. So reconciliation must also create a more equitable and inclusive society by closing the gaps in social health and economic outcomes. And this is perhaps one of the more maybe quote unquote mainstream aspects about the idea of closing the gaps. And that's kind of often the focus in conversations of reconciliation. Not so much a talk about what the gaps are or why they may exist or why current strategies aren't effective, but really just that emphasis on the deficit of Indigenous peoples, whether it be our health outcomes or whatever that may look like. So all Canadians as treaty people should share responsibility for establishing and maintaining mutually respectful relationships. So again, that's the piece that people kind of pull from that broader definition as well. And so, well, that's important. It needs to be considered alongside the other principles too. It calls for the importance of Indigenous elders and traditional keepers and their concepts around ethics and practices of reconciliation. So, as I had mentioned before, we as Anishinaabe people, we have treaties with other nations, both human and non-human, aside from our treaties that we have with the Canadian state. So as part of the history of colonialism, that's put us in a place where we have a difficult time upholding those other treaties. So, and that's what's at the heart of many disputes that you see with land defenders. So those land defenders, whether it be in Wet'suwet'en, whether it be on Mohawk territory or anywhere else, who are usually largely women too, they're doing that for their communities, but they also have legal obligations to do that as well. So they're legally obligated to do that through the treaties that they have with other, particularly non-human nations. So when we think about the concept of reconciliation through an Indigenous lens, not only do we need to reconcile the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, but non-Indigenous peoples need to understand how their actions have also harmed our relationships with other nations, and have to consider then how part of that reconciliation process could be about reconciling those harms, and having us be in a place again where we're able to uphold all of our treaty responsibilities. So that one I find is a principle that's much less talked about, but for me, I would say that's a key principle. And so if I think people could really understand that principle and understand that point about treaties and the role of land defenders and what they're doing there, we'd be a lot further along. So it's also important to support Indigenous peoples' cultural revitalization and integrating Indigenous knowledge systems, including stories, laws, protocols, connections to the land. So that's very much a part of that concept that I had just talked about. And you'll notice here, stories, laws, and protocols are all spelled out differently, but they're all related too. So many of our stories also contain our laws. So that's an important point. How information is passed along, how it's presented can be very different within an Indigenous context. But what had happened is, instead of taking the time to fully understand that, Indigenous peoples were then just viewed as being less than, so as not having our own legal systems, not having our own economic systems, etc., even though they existed and they still do exist. So then reconciliation requires political will, joint leadership, trust building, accountability, and transparency, as well as substantial investment of resources. So this is a big one, political will, and that's driven too, right, by the will of communities, the will of the public. So the more people are willing to talk about these principles and really have a conviction about the importance of these principles and why they need to be adhered to, perhaps we'll start to see some change within our political landscape. And substantial investments are also important. But it's also important to recognize that substantial investments for reconciliation doesn't exclude conversations about investments for other aspects as well. And I'll touch on that in a little bit. So reconciliation also requires sustained public education and dialogue, including youth engagement about Indian residential schools, treaties, and Indigenous rights, as well as contemporary issues. And so we've talked a lot about education already, and that very much is usually maybe one of the more prominent points. So we see that in terms of some efforts, although we had a, with Doug Ford's government, really kind of pushing back against Indian residential school education within our school systems. But we have still seen some progress here. So just to kind of close about what reconciliation is, I thought it would be important to talk about what reconciliation is not. So there's definitely relationships between reconciliation and these different terms, but they're not one and the same. So decolonization, that may be a term that you've heard before, or if not, will probably, if you're working in Indigenous spaces, will be a term that you would hear at some point. And so this is about, some people had talked about it too in terms of reconciliation. It's really about that deconstruction and that reconstruction. But what's different about decolonization is really centered within Indigenous peoples. So reconciliation is about the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. Decolonization is really about our nations at the heart. And so if you're interested in kind of learning about some of these concepts a bit more, Eve Tuck, who's an Indigenous scholar, she does a lot of work in this area. So really anything by her would be great for you to look at. But she talks about this idea of decolonization being about repatriation of Indigenous land and life, and it really being accountable to Indigenous sovereignty and our visions as Indigenous peoples of our future. So there's a definite relationship there, because it's difficult to decolonize if you're continuing to deal with colonialism. And so that's the responsibility in terms of reconciliation, to make sure that actions have been taken to rectify that, and that it doesn't happen in the future. And then you may have also heard this idea of Indigenous resurgence. So that's just being a bit more specific of when we're talking about decolonization of, for us as Indigenous peoples, deconstructing and reconstructing. Indigenous resurgence is really focused on that reconstruction piece. That's really what it's talking about. How can we begin to reintegrate our own laws? How could we relearn our stories? How could we relearn and redevelop intimate relationships with the land? That's what that is. And then inherent Aboriginal or treaty rights. So part of reconciliation is respecting those, but again, it's not one and the same thing. So I just wanted to kind of touch on some of those main points around reconciliation. And the first one in the definition was about awareness of the past. So this is that education piece. And again, I just, for the limits of time, I won't go into this in too much detail, but I really just wanted to touch on a couple of the key points that I think it's important to understand if you're engaged in reconciliation work within an environmental context. So one is this idea of the doctrine of discovery. And so what the doctrine of discovery was, it's really comes forward from the series of what's called papal bulls, or these documents that were released by popes that basically were self-proclamations that said, if territories aren't occupied, and by occupied really meant occupied in a way that is satisfactory to European use, then we could claim these lands for our own. And so this idea of the doctrine of discovery, although the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as well as other international documents, talks about how these really shouldn't have any bearing on issues of land title, and they don't justify or legitimate land title. They still in many cases have served the basis for occupation of Indigenous lands. And so the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada also speaks about this, and there's a recommendation for Canada to really speak against and say these doctrines have no warrant and don't result in any legitimate claim to title by colonial states. But again, we're still where we are today. And so this is just, I included, this is actually an example that came from Australia, but it's just an example of one form of a doctrine of discovery or one of the papal bulls. And so what happened in this case in Australia is that they were actually in the process of signing a treaty, but then they decided, why go through the process of signing a treaty when we could actually just create this unilateral document and then claim the land that way. And so even when we look at Canada and we look at BC, for example, there's a lot of territory in BC where there's no treaties that have been signed. And so why that's the case is that when settlers brought smallpox to BC, it was devastating to Indigenous communities. And there was no help for Indigenous communities. And in fact, in the Vancouver area, they were just encouraged to leave. And this was known, this strategy was known because then they thought, well, if Indigenous nations or groups go to others for help, this is great, then they'll infect those communities too. So huge amounts of the population were decimated. And so although you see a little bit of treaties in Vancouver, why you don't see treaties throughout all of BC is because the decision was made that we'll just wait it out a little bit. We'll let smallpox take its course. And while communities are dealing with the effects of smallpox and their nations are weakened, this is an opportunity for us to go in and assert our title over the land. So in many ways, that was also an example of the doctrine of discovery. So we have this ongoing history of assumptions that Indigenous peoples don't have relationships to land, or that if they aren't occupying the land in a particular way, it's also called this idea of underdevelopment sometimes, then it's the right of the Western state, to the colonial state, to go in and use those lands appropriately. So also, and this also has been talked about in Supreme Court cases as well. The next one is the relationship between conservation and Aboriginal peoples. So there's a few ways in which Aboriginal rights can be violated. And one of those ways is in the name of conservation. So because of that, right, there's always going to be this tension between Indigenous peoples and conservation efforts. And so this isn't to say that Indigenous peoples are opposed to ideas of sustainability. Those are entrenched within our laws of how to live in this place in a sustainable way. The concept of 7 generations, right? Always thinking every decision you make 500 years in the past and 500 years in the future. So, but what I am saying is the mechanisms in which the Canadian government and others in Canada choose to assert or move forward with conservation is where the tension lies. And so we see in basically every park that exists across Canada, Indigenous peoples were removed from those parks. And in some cases, their villages were burned down, so to ensure that they wouldn't move back and continue. So this idea of Indigenous peoples losing what's at the heart of their community, having their communities burned down, being relocated, so it could be a leisurely place for non-Indigenous peoples. I think it just shows that colonial mentality. So it's important to be mindful of that. And again, so if there's hesitation in terms of conservation, it largely is probably not coming from a place of not sharing the same long-term objective of addressing loss of biodiversity or addressing climate change. But it comes from that history and the way in which conservation has been operationalized within Canada. And so attached to this idea, it's also important to keep in mind just the history of environmentalism. And so while efforts are being made to kind of repair and improve that relationship, we still see many cases, again, of perhaps environmentalism being approached from a particular worldview. So if people haven't seen the documentary Angry Inuk, that's a great example. And it talks about really this war against the seal trade that the Inuit people have. And what they actually talked about in the documentary is that, ironically, if we're not able to make money off of the seals, we'll have no choice but to actually sign deals with resource development corporations, so we have some livelihood in our community. So really not understanding the history of those practices. And so for us as Anishinaabe people too, that's actually part of our treaties with those animals, is that they've offered to give their lives to us so that we could sustain ourselves. And in turn, we have different responsibilities back to those animals. So when there's environmentalists who are, protesting about the seal trade, then they're now interfering within our own treaty relationships too, we have with those nations. So it's important to think about it from that perspective. And so there's been this idea of whiteness of the environmental movement. And when I say whiteness, I don't just mean white people. What I'm talking about really is whiteness is a social construct that really talks about how, or is associated with different norms and power and privilege. So in that example, in Angry Inuk, we see whiteness is there because, again, that idea of conservation is approached through a very particular lens. So these are just some considerations, and I think it's probably about time that we take a break. We're almost at 11:30, and I want to leave some time for discussion and for us to partake in a couple of interactive activities as well. But here's just some considerations. So looking at that acknowledgement and atonement piece. So one, is reconciliation worked as or framed as Indigenous work? So this goes back to that slide where I was mentioning what reconciliation is not. So it's not the same as decolonization. It's not the same about Indigenous resurgence. So I think that's always an important distinction to make. Reconciliation work, although it's about, right, Indigenous peoples need to be centered in that, but it's really about settlers because they're the ones who have to make amends for the past harms and ongoing harms that were caused. So reconciliation isn't really a radical framework. It's really just the minimum of what needs to happen to atone for past harms. And so there's other things that could be done that would actually be framed as Indigenous work. And so I'm an educator, and maybe just an example I could provide. So we have courses meant for non-Indigenous students to teach them about Indigenous histories. So in that case, though, it's important to think about, well, where's the budget coming from? Is that coming out of funds that are earmarked for Indigenous initiatives, funds that perhaps could be used to support activities that Indigenous students would want to see? So that goes to the next point. Then, does advancing reconciliation agenda require divestments from decolonization efforts? So if you're focusing on reconciliation, are there certain needs or wants of the community then that aren't about making amends, but that could be important? And how are those being taken into consideration? So always thinking about how reconciliation can impact and directly benefit Indigenous communities. So again, that education piece is really important, but if all of your time, attention, and resources are going into education, are Indigenous people seeing direct benefits from that? So the role of Indigenous knowledges and traditions is also really important. And I just put this here. This is something that I do sometimes, or an exercise that I get people to do. And we've already done it a couple of times within this session. Sometimes it's important to decontextualize to contextualize. So a lot of times, right, like reconciliation, it's about common sense. And we all, just through our own social lives, have our own relationships and have, maybe not at a nation level or a structural level, but have dealt with reconciliation in one shape or form. So I always try to tell people it can be helpful sometimes to actually remove the situation from the context and see if you'd come up with a different result. And if that's the case, why is it? So for example, if you caused harm to someone, say, you know, that you weren't paying attention, you ran into their vehicle. And then they said, I need you to pay for this vehicle, and you agree, okay. So if that seems to make common sense, then think about in relation to what's happening at a national level. So if that idea makes sense of, okay, the person who suffered the harm, they have a big role to play in terms of deciding what reconciliation looks like. Yes, I totally agree and understand that I caused the harm, and so I need to have retribution for the harm. So that makes sense in that example. And so then why in the broader Indigenous context is that something that our nation seems to have such a hard time with? And so think about what assumptions or differences exist there that may be the underlying reason. So in that example, one thing that comes to mind is you're not really giving up power or privilege by helping someone fix their car, but that different context exists when we're thinking about reconciliation at a national scale. So that's just a tool that, if it's helpful, you could use yourself in terms of trying to understand what are those nuances or assumptions or differences that exist when we're talking about reconciliation in Indigenous contexts that make it really difficult then to be able to move forward. So if we don't acknowledge that history that existed, that context of the treaties, something that could inadvertently happen within our land acknowledgements, then we're really just privileging those colonial notions of the treaties. And those are really problematic because as Anishinaabe people, we firmly accept that signing treaties didn't mean that we gave up title to land. So we don't want to create a situation where within the traditional land acknowledgement itself, we're also at the same time legitimizing the Canadian state's sovereignty over that lands by the way we talk about the treaties. So that's something that I don't see happen very often, but I think is really important. Just seeing a comment here, it says, I was giving a greeting like this for a diversity group and including greeting words from various Indigenous languages over the lands of the participants. Is that a good idea? So I think it is really great if you could include language from the nations whose territories you're residing on, because then it shows to that you're trying to understand, and language is a key part in understanding. But at the same time, try to make sure with language, whenever you can, try to understand what that language is actually saying. And so with Bojo, for example, that's something we say hello. That's how we say hello within this area. So when we are actually saying Bojo or Bijou, you might hear different ways that's pronounced. What that's referring to is we actually have stories about Nanabush, also referred to as Nanabojo or Wanabojo. And that's a spiritual being that's really significant to us and has taught us a lot of lessons. A lot of our stories talk about Wanabojo. And Wanabojo played an important role in creating what we see here on Turtle Island. And so we have a story that talks about, basically because of behavior and things that were happening, Wanabojo left, but said there'll be a time too where you'll really need me and I'll come back. And so Wanabojo also is a shapeshifter. So Wanabojo, anyone in this webinar could be Wanabojo right now. So when we address people, when we say hello, that's what we're asking. We're asking, are you Wanabojo? So understanding the importance of the language, just same thing as a traditional land acknowledgement. The more you could understand the meaning behind it, the more you could actually then engage with that and operationalize that in a meaningful way. It becomes more than going through the motions of, I'm going to say hello in an Indigenous language or give this territorial acknowledgement. So I put together a couple of different exercises for us to do, and this was one of your handouts. So this is just a scenario, and I thought this potentially could be perhaps something that you could encounter as you're doing your bird counts. So I think what I'll do, I'll put people into breakout rooms, give you a chance to read it and discuss it a bit. And so when you're discussing the scenario, think about the following. So first of all, you could just record your original thoughts on the scenario. So I find that's something that's really helpful instead of, right, I've put some questions here to frame it for you, but just kind of having that honest space of what is the first thing that comes to mind, or, you know, that you feel when you read this scenario. And that's something you could share, or that's something that you could just keep for yourself and maybe reflect upon. But for this scenario, think about what might be problematic in the scenario and also why it might be problematic. And then discuss how could this situation have been avoided and what opportunities exist along the way to change. So the question before of how could the situation be avoided, that's kind of more of an upfront question. And then the other one is, what are some opportunities kind of throughout the scenario where there's an opportunity to perhaps make a change within it? So Kathy, I see you have your hand up. Do you want to share?
Am I off now? Yes, I got voted to chair because from our group, because we'd gone over the scenario quite carefully. So I just have points on the three things you asked us. And problematic, what was problematic? A lot, mainly Jack. There was a definite lack of respect and communication. There was also a sense of entitlement. Mm-hmm. There was a lack of humility, was finding the terminology that we felt really fit well, and a lack of open-mindedness from both Jack and Jill. Mm-hmm. Now, how could this have been avoided? I like to say this as those common sense things that you mentioned: listening, education, better manners. All those things could come into play and make a difference to avoid this unhappy scenario when it was all done. And there was some great opportunities. Like if Jack and Jill had known the area before they'd gone in, if they had reached out the community, or if they had just approached the conversation differently and tried to show respect and communicate well with Fred, I think the outcome could have been very different here. And everybody could have walked away with a much more positive and respectful position. Yeah.
Great. Did others talk about similar things, or were there any other things mentioned, or perhaps different opinions?
We were pretty much all on the same positioning with it. We all felt that we would have handled the situation. Well, I shouldn't say that. We all felt that we hoped we would handle the situation differently. One member said that her work with Indigenous communities showed that line of communications and that interaction between people at the beginning is extremely important, which was good to hear. Mm-hmm. But it was more the case that we all discussed how we felt the situation could have been handled differently or better. Yeah.
Great. And what about did any of the other groups want to share? If you had anything different or to add?
I guess I can speak for our group, and feel free to jump in, anyone else from our group who wants to correct me. We were kind of saying that, you know, if we look at ourselves and like we kind of humble ourselves. Any one of us can be Jack or Jill in this situation, right? And there's kind of two parts. Number one, did Jack and Jill research the area, which was kind of talked about before, and like do that appropriate, like what, like who not necessarily is occupying this land, but what is this land? And if they, number one, if they didn't research it, then that's, you know, a line of communication that can be addressed in the actual conflict of, oh, like, I didn't know we were here, like, I didn't, sorry, whatever. I would suggest leaving and then, you know, maybe reaching out to the community then. The second line is if, like, specifically for our purposes in the Atlas, if we do have that open line of communication with communities and we are able to go and survey in that land and perhaps a member of the community just isn't aware, what do we do at that case? And so we were kind of trying to come up with ideas of this is a real possibility and how do we have this relationship and what conversation should we be having now prior to the Atlas, you know, kicking off in breeding season to reduce this, you know, potential conflict. What do we do even just province-wide, whether or not it's in like an association with an Indigenous community, to have that respectful conversation with our volunteers and also with the different communities. And so we were kind of trying to think of some actionable items that we could do to maintain that respectful relationship prior to getting into a situation like this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's always key, that upfront piece. It may take some more time, but it often, in terms of ongoing relationships, is really helpful and it pays off in the long run. What about, I think we had 5 groups, so I've heard from 3 people. So I think there's maybe 2 groups left. Is there anyone else who wants to share?
I can go if I may. I think our group agreed very much with Kathy's group sentiment that 99% of the time being forthright, honest, and engaging and explaining what you're hoping to do is going to diffuse any situation like this. So I guess what we're looking for is maybe some discussion of what to do on that 1% when it doesn't. And I'm hearing from some people in our group and also perhaps from others that the solution is walk away. Walking away is fine, but you know, it means lost time and whatnot. So I guess for me, I always have a problem with an individual representing themselves as a spokesperson for a larger group, and that individual may not carry the actual message of the group appropriately to everyone. So is walking away the only solution? Taking time to attempt to contact the band to find out if that is the general attitude, or is there another solution that people might suggest?
Great. And I'm wondering if the last group wants to share, and then I'll come around and talk about some themes and considerations.
In our room, I think the themes and points that others have raised came up in our group. The one observation that was shared was the notion that birders would somehow be standoffish and just back away from it all without even attempting to explain what they were doing. People wearing binoculars and saying, I'm bird watching, or I'm doing this, or I'm doing that, oftentimes breaks the ice. And there were some comments about how this scenario was perhaps a little too artificial. Although troubling and echoed by others, this notion of, well, we have the right to be here and so on and so forth. I think, as we heard with other groups, a little bit of research and a little bit of, or a lot of communication beforehand is going to solve an awful lot of this. We also noted that Fred didn't actually ask anyone to leave. He just wanted to know what was going on, which I think is also a very, very important element.
Great. And last group, is there anything you want to share?
Yeah, I can definitely speak for our group, and if anybody else has anything to add, they can definitely feel free to jump in. I would say that we echo sort of the same statements that we've all discussed. I think the situation was handled quite poorly, and there was really a lack of communication and of background knowledge going into that situation. And something that our group kind of discussed was, where could we find this information if we were looking for it, say, prior to going on a survey of, say, the reserve lands that were located in the area we were going to survey, just so we could, get that knowledge and have that knowledge base coming into it, so it would be, a more positive situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there is a link to Native Lands, which is a great resource. But also in terms of organizing. So if you could easily like Google and see a map of all the First Nations in Ontario. So you could go to the Chiefs of Ontario and find that information. And so a lot of communities usually have their own website too. But if you're not really sure where to start there, a lot of communities also have broader governance structures. So these are called tribal councils that are at a kind of, they perform a service function. And then at a political level, there's political territorial organizations, also known as PTOs. So these will provide information on the communities that are a part of their organization, and usually provide a description on the community as a starting point. So if depending on your area, there's multiples. So here in the Thunder Bay area, we have Grand Council Treaty 3. Well, sorry, just to the west of us, we have Anishinaabe Aski Nation. We have Union of Ontario Indians. And then we have many tribal councils like Nokiwan Tribal Council, for example. So Googling any of those kinds of terms, and I see someone put the link for Chiefs of Ontario in the website, will help you find out who is the local community, or more than one, because in many cases traditional territory can overlap too as well. So that's an important then, just to understand that, then if to understand that whole history. So perhaps if you're then engaging with one community and not the other, and they both assert that that's their traditional territory, then you're kind of being involved in those politics maybe without realizing that you have that involvement there. So I just wanted to pick up on a couple of points. One, I think the starting point of, so obviously I picked a scenario where I wanted it to be some tensions, right? To create some tensions, to have some more discussion points. But at the same time, I think some people's comments on having the humility to know, right, if you are in the bush, perhaps you're alone and someone approaches you, you may actually react this way potentially, right? Like sometimes we don't know until we're in that situation, but it's important to then think about why maybe we reacted that way. And living in Canada, we're not usually, especially as settlers, used of being questioned about our actions on territory or why we're in certain places. So I just put this here because, it may kind of evoke that conversation piece about, could I react this way? If you think not, why not? If you think maybe, think about that a little bit. One thing I also noticed when some people talked about this scenario, they had added some of their own information in the scenario. So that might be a reflection piece. Think about kind of how maybe you had taken the scenario and recrafted it, and how that maybe speaks to some understanding that you have or where you're at in terms of this process of reconciliation. I also saw raised this idea of representation. So this is one that comes up a lot in Indigenous contexts. So it's important to understand that there's band and council, and so they have a level of jurisdiction. And while they assert jurisdiction over our traditional territories, according to the Indian Act, their jurisdiction is reserve lands. So those are two different things. Reserve lands are lands that are allocated for Indigenous use within the Indian Act, and traditional territories are much more expansive territories where we have long-standing relationships, and would, because prior to the Indian Act, we would move around seasonally. So we wouldn't stay in a little area like when we were combined to the reserve system. So when we're thinking of representation, we need to respect chief and council, but we also need to acknowledge that chief and council is elected through a imposed system that was specifically put in place to dismantle Indigenous governance structures. So we also have grassroots leaders, we also have knowledge holders. So if there's someone out in the bush, they probably maybe are a hunter, or maybe are gathering medicine, or have probably some awareness, and may have a role in the community in that respect. So I think we should never just assume that because someone's not chief and council, that they aren't representative of the community in some way, shape, or form. And so some other pieces that I heard is maybe the idea that Fred could have figured it out. Okay, we have binoculars, we're here, but I don't know what that bird count looks like. If you may have pens and pencils and papers with you. But so there's an ongoing issue that still happens today where people come into Indigenous territory for a number of different reasons. Mining, exploration is one, and don't announce that they're there. So it's important to acknowledge that there is this ongoing history of people coming to Indigenous territory, acting in a way where they're entitled to be there. And that has historically and has continued to have negative impacts on Indigenous peoples. So that's just another piece. So think about that history slide too, right? About the idea of land not being occupied in the way we would like to see it. So just because you don't see a house there and a fence, it doesn't mean that there isn't a presence or relationship in that territory. And I know we're running out of time here. So I think the suggestions people had were great about having an upfront conversation, also being upfront of what you're doing. And we'll talk about this more in our next session on research. And so we haven't really approached it through that lens, and that'll provide a bit more consideration for thinking about this situation and how we, because I think very much in this situation, what I've heard too is the idea of birding being like an innocent act. And so why would anyone have a problem with birding? So I want to take that idea and think about it in the context of research during our next session, and see if that changes the conversation a little bit. So I think there's also some pieces around education here. So there is clearly a difference of understanding between traditional territory and crown land. And so the idea of crown land, that's another technology of the state, again, to try to dispossess Indigenous peoples from their lands. So that might be another important concept to consider when we look at crown land, and maybe some assumptions that we have about crown land. So there's been different Supreme Court rulings which talk about Indigenous people still having rights because we still have claims over much of the public lands, both in terms of parks and outside of parks as well. And maybe the last point I'll make here is, yeah, there's Jack and Jill at the end, they really seem to center themselves. So they talked about their frustration, they talked about their day being ruined, and then there was a centering of their own experience, or we use that term whiteness, right, in looking at the scenario. So Jill says, if I saw someone out in the bush, I wouldn't care what they were doing. But that same history doesn't exist of terra nullius, of land dispossession, of colonialism. So that's a great example of how that whiteness was centered. And then the last comment here by Fred is that this would only benefit the community. So it was his loss in the long run. And so there's a name for it. It's called in settler and Indigenous studies, Eve Tuck, who I talked about. She refers to this as a move to innocence. And what this is really about is different strategies or positions that attempt to relieve non-Indigenous peoples of responsibility or guilt, and where they don't have to give up any land, power, or privilege. So by Jack saying that he will benefit from this, the First Nation community will benefit from this, or the person, without really having to ask him what would be better, talk to the community what would be better. So feeling like they're doing a great service, but that was very much self-directed. So there's no giving up land, power, or privilege within that instance. So we're out of time for today, but maybe a question to leave everyone with is to think about, so for the Bird Atlas project, so is that reconciliation in action? And how do you think that the Bird Atlas project can reflect on the principles of reconciliation? And maybe another question, if it's more meaningful to you, is how can the Bird Atlas project live the territorial land acknowledgement too? So I see there's some questions in the chat box, but we're out of time. So maybe what I could do, I could follow up with those as well if there's questions, and we can send out an email afterwards if we aren't able to address them in the session next week. So I just want to say miigwech to everyone for listening, for your openness today, and for your time today as well.
Just in closing, I'd also like to thank Dr. Ray for sharing her time and expertise with us today. Miigwech. I'd like to thank John Hassel for keeping our technology functioning well. It seemed pretty good. And of course, thank all of you for making the time today to have this discussion. I think we all recognize that this is just the beginning of a much longer conversation around how our Atlas is going to shift to more of what Dr. Ray had expressed about how we're actually implementing reconciliation in the actions that we do. So with that, I was just going to remind everyone that we do have, there's a session tomorrow night that is the same as this one. So if you know of anyone who missed the session this morning and would like to attend, please suggest to them that they register, and we'll try to get that all worked out by tomorrow. And then next week, we will be having an additional webinar on working with Indigenous peoples in research settings, where we are going to be looking, specifically at bird surveys. And as Dr. Ray mentioned, there are questions in the chat box. We'll try to collate some of those and respond to all of this once these 2 webinars are finished, and try to provide more information. Then also that may open up a desire, I think, from all of us to continue having webinars and discussions and presentations and dialogue around Indigenous engagement.